Hello. So we have entered an area where cyber threats are looming larger and more complex than ever. And so the role of the Chief Information Security Officer is under even more intense scrutiny. The SEC recently did an overhaul of cyber disclosure rules that has dramatically raised the stakes for public companies. So now, on top of everything else, they're demanding really unprecedented levels of transparency, rapid reporting, a proactive stance on cybersecurity. So this new regulatory landscape not only challenges organizations to reassess cybersecurity strategies, but it also puts the CISO squarely at the intersection of technology vigilance, of strategic planning, of regulatory compliance. So today, in discussions with two thought leaders, we're going to dive deep into the heart of these challenges. And we're going to explore these tensions, the tensions between maintaining operational secrecy and fulfilling regulatory mandates. So the evolving role of the CISO in this dynamic environment and how solutions can help to navigate these treacherous waters. I would like to give a big thank you to Tanium for sponsoring today's discussion. It's so important to explore these topics. It's so important to explore them right now. And we really appreciate Tanium's support in this. First, I'd like to welcome to the stage Shira Rubinoff. She is a preeminent cybersecurity expert and chief cybersecurity officer. Hi, Shira. How are you?
Hi, pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So I'm so happy you're here because you bring just an absolute wealth of experience in leading cybersecurity initiatives, developing strategic security solutions, and you've got such a deep understanding of the entire landscape and how it impacts organizational strategy. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation with you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I'd also like to welcome Tim Morris to stage. Tim is the Chief Security Officer, Chief Security Advisor and Technology Strategist at Tanium. And Tim Morris offers a really unique perspective on the intersection of technology and security. Hi, Tim. How are you?
Hey, everybody. Nice to be here.
Well, so you not only have expertise in leveraging technology to really support organizational resilience against cyber threats, and you're a real pivotal voice in discussions on the space, but you've spent over 20 years in banking. So this is really important experience for this discussion in particular. Really happy to have you.
Thank you very much. Yes, I had the opportunity to serve for over 20 years in a large financial institution managing a very large estate. If you measure that in endpoints, over 500,000. I spent 9 years in manufacturing prior to that. So yeah, technology is in my blood, but I crossed the security boundary, I don't know, about 2 decades ago and never looked back.
Well, let's jump in. I can't wait to get started. Disclosure rules have been around for a while, but something is different about what's happening right now. So I was hoping to start there. Tim, could you maybe help set us in perspective, give us some context?
Sure. So if you look at regulations in general, they come about and policies come about to help govern what companies have not been able to do through self-regulation or self-governance. And disclosure rules have been around a while. Different regulatory bodies have asked, say, hey, report this in a certain amount of time. However, when that reporting, what I think they discovered, those of us doing the reporting kind of knew this, they're missing context. Like, it's not just enough for checkbox compliant to say, yes, this happened or we had that. There needs to be more details. And what I believe I'm pretty sure the SEC has done in the spirit of protecting investors as well as consumers is to say, hey, we've had these breaches going on now for 20 years and they seem to get worse. No matter how much money we pile into security, every one of us seems to get a letter once a week with free credit monitoring, right? So the SEC is saying, hey, we're going to put some teeth in. So yes, they've done some investigations. They've discovered things, and now they're doing things, not only just the expediency in reporting of what they did, materiality, which has been around in the finance and investor world for some time, but now some more transparency on what the consequences were of that attack or breach. And then looking, as you said earlier, the proactive approach, like what is it what are we measuring to see that this doesn't continue happening in the future? And I'll pause there, but to me, that's how I see the gist of what is being asked, going forward.
Sure, I'd love to get your perspective on this. I'm really interested to hear for you what's different about this particular moment. What about these regulations?
Well, certainly great questions. So there's a lot of changes going on, but the biggest one really is the lack of transparency is now directly tied to the person at the helm. So typically the CISO, and this translates for the CISO directly to more stress, more pressure than ever before. And, that's a lot of talk in the CXO area, which primarily the CISO. And you come up with I was thinking about 5 different pointers that the CISO could do. So, they're dealing with the stress, they're dealing with everything on their shoulders, that they're actually now held personally liable for some of this stuff, which is very scary for a person in this type of situation or having this type of pressure on them in the organization. So one of the things is review your organization's current incident responses and reporting processes. And you'd think that's a very simple thing to do, and everyone should have done it or has done it, but you'd be surprised. There's so much going on in the organizations, and that's a critical piece. You really need to know what your organization is doing to be proactive and reactive, and how that's going hand in hand in your organization. And the need for detailed compliance. And now it's also been, sorry, there's a lag over there. I'm sorry. So the new regulations also require publicly traded companies in the U.S. and foreign companies that trade in the U.S. to disclose cybersecurity incidents within 4 business days. So when I'm talking about 4 business days, think about the CISO sitting there, think about the extra pressure. They have to understand what to report. So here's the funny thing. They say report as much as you can, then report as little as you can, but only report what you're confident about. So that's been a topic that they talk about within organizations. So what is a CISO to do? They have to make sure to be open. They have to make sure to be transparent. They have to report enough, but don't report too much, because then you could open the door for attack vectors. So that's another problem you have to think about. We could dive into that. I'm sure that's something coming down the pipes in the webinar. That's a very interesting space. But you also have to report what you're confident about. So think when the liability is sitting on the CISO, and they might be, what's the percentage of confidence for reporting? So that's kind of just giving the umbrella of what's going on here, sitting and resting on the CISO's shoulders.
Yeah, it's such an interesting time, because what you laid out is feels almost like an impossible situation. And so navigation and tools and support are going to be so important as we take this next step. Gartner came out with a report that we were talking about before we went live. And Tim, you were mentioning this. I hope could you take us through what you were telling us about in the report and what really stood out for you in that?
Well, the report is, there's 2 different ways to look at that. The CISO and how that, as Shira just described, the liability has changed. But I also look at it as, before, these SEC forms that were going forward were boilerplate languages. And so that change has now happened, that no longer can you get away with just boilerplate language of what's going on. In the Gartner report, specifically as far as the liability of the CISO, what's going to end up happening is, I've heard 2 different camps. There are some, fear mongers say, well, nobody wants a CISO job anymore. Others are like, well, this is a prime opportunity to go in because maybe compensation levels increase. What I've encouraged folks, just like Shira did, is 1, get your planning down correctly. Make sure you're testing those plans, and be transparent to what degree you can. Side note to what was mentioned, FBI.gov, if there's something, if disclosing something may cause greater harm to the public, or maybe even national security, then you have a route. You go through the FBI. We believe they're going to approve many of those to say, hey, you don't have to report them publicly. But I think that's important to note, that you do have that route to do that. I also encourage CISOs, make sure that D&O insurance, directors and officers insurance, that usually covers, boards and directors. You're going to need to have that conversation. Hey, now that this role is prominent in the limelight, and you're going to be in the room with the CFO, with legal counsel, and the CEO to determine what it is you're going to report or not report. But again, back to what Shira said, don't wait for that incident to figure it out. I mean, folks are already reporting. Go out there and look. These are public, disclosures. Go look at what they've done, what looks good, what looks like it's done well, what's not. How do you report and be transparent without creating more liability? Have that conversation with legal. What's attorney-client privilege? What's not? How are you going to tag something attorney-client privilege? So it's not fodder for a future investigation or possibly class action lawsuits or those kind of things. So that's kind of where I start. But I want to ask you, Allison, is there something specific about the Gartner report that kind of caught your eye that you're looking for feedback on?
Well, what I'm hearing from both of you, and what we've talked about before, is that there's we need to reassess our frameworks and how we're approaching our frameworks to be able to navigate through this, what feels like a very challenging situation that Shira outlined for us. And then that means also what kind of new tools or what kind of enhanced tools can we turn to support us in those frameworks. And then there's, once you have that, there's a need to have guidance through this difficult decision process on how it gets reported, if it gets reported, and what the path is there. So maybe we break down all three areas. Maybe we start with those frameworks. So I'm curious, in light of these rules, how specifically should CISOs be adjusting their cybersecurity frameworks to really focus on enhancing transparency and reporting? What are you seeing there, Shira, or how are you thinking about that?
No, thank you. I'm glad we got back to that because I was telling you the 5 points and I covered one. So again, we'll go back to it, which is, again, as to Tim's point, where again, we talked about reviewing your organization's current incident response and reporting processes, which is critical. That's step one. Next would be to assess the threat landscape. So threat actors' techniques change, but identity remains a consistent in the attack lifecycle. So understanding that, you get a better scope. So also evaluating existing controls. As part of the SEC's new rules, companies must add specific details about their cybersecurity programs in their annual 10K filings. So it's really understanding and evaluating what's existing in the controls that they're dealing with. And next would be prepare for materiality, decision-making. So part of a CISO's job is to rapidly assess the situation and to provide relevant information about what happened, when it happened, what was impacted, what is still unknown. And that's a big deal also, that piece. I just want to stop for a moment. What is still unknown? When we're gathering information and we're trying to report on it, there's always kind of that little thing left there. What don't we know? So really assessing that and understanding what's left to gather the information around and making strategic decisions on how to gather that information that's unknown, because that could be your Achilles heel right there. So you have to be careful with that in order to help your organization make a proper call. And next would be sharpen business risk and communication skills. So a lot of organizations, like who reports to who says what to, who gets the call, how do we communicate with each other? Do we have that open door policy? We have to share with each other and elevate your cybersecurity risk management to a CXO business function. So it's not just the CISO. It really needs to go across the entire CXO area, across the management position, because I talk about digital transformation across organizations all the time, where typically in organizations, each role is incentivized by something else. COO, hey, make sure that things are running as fast as they can. Bottom line is what counts. CISO and CSO, they're worried about, wait a second, we got to slow down, we got to patch, we got to worry about the security. So it's kind of butting heads. So if you're able, again, in the communications piece, but also incentivized to work together as a whole, you'll have better outcome.
So you just outlined 5 different areas. Help us understand how are people reacting to this? How are they managing all of these new things that need to get done to be able to move forward and to be compliant? What do you find? How are they actually feeling about it? How are they approaching it? Shira, how do you think about that?
Yes. Yeah, so I will say a lot of the things that are coming down here, and it's talking about reporting and specifics about reporting and timeframes, et cetera. But bottom line, I believe it's nothing really new. It's the communication really needed to be there. The security needs to be there. The assessments need to be there. You need to have proper incident response and reporting processes. You have to have people in place to do that. You have to have your hierarchy about what happens should an incident occur. How do you curtail that? How do you find out information? All that should have been there already. It's really now understanding about what you have and how to implement it and do it on a more speedily way and a more open way. So it's understanding what to report, what not to report, but how to report it in a more concise way that's transparent, but still having all your ducks in a row. That has not changed. So I don't think it's something really that shakes everyone up, but it's more of who's personally responsible for this. And, as Tim was mentioning, what he was seeing in this world and what he's mentioning to other people and CISOs in the industry is very critical. But I personally know a number of CISOs that said they don't want this job anymore. It's too much liability, personal liability, but it's a very important role. And the people that are stepping up to do that role, hats off to you. We need people like you.
Extremely.
So stakes have gone up. Yeah, Tim, how do you think about it?
Well, I want to go back. Sure, you said something very, very important. Every time I see a new regulation, everybody kind of scurries. Now, granted, I'm not going to belittle the changes in this regulation because they are big and they're like, hey, you really need to pay attention. But what I always say is these regulations or reporting disclosures should not cause you to go create new playbooks. These playbooks should already rest upon foundational programs you have built for mature IT organizations as well as security organizations that are actually frameworks help kind of define those, or if not, they provide the information that says, hey, this framework that we're using, whatever that might be, NIST, CMM, or MITRE ATT&CK, whatever framework you're using to help protect, or maybe a combination of all of them, we need to really, really lean into those programs. What I'm seeing is the programs typically don't work. You typically get the political problem, that OSI layer 8 problem, we call it, because there's 7 technical layers, and then there's the people problem at the top. And these silos is that we really need to focus and lean in on the programs like change management, like problem management, like disaster recovery and business continuity planning. When you're doing an incident response plan that would help satisfy that you have a program in place to protect an organization, that incident response plan needs to use every one of those other foundational programs that should already be there. What we see is they get dysfunctional because, one, not everybody's talking about the same data. I remember preparing for a regulator one time. We had 8 different groups in the room that were going to report a particular way where we're assessing vulnerabilities. And when I asked them a very simple question, okay, how many assets are you responsible for? I got 8 completely different answers, and only 2 of them were close. And I was like, when we go in front of the regulators, we're going to look really foolish because we don't even know our own internal environment well enough. I've done lots of public speaking. I've yet to run across a team that says we love our CMDB. Our configuration management database is accurate. All the data is there, not only just the assets, which would be a dream, but also the configurations of those. When you go through an incident, you're in a crisis management. That could be an outage that you may think is cyber related or may not cyber related, or you're in a full-blown incident. There's a 0-day vulnerability being exploited, maybe even have an attacker on the inside. And when you're sitting in those war rooms, I can tell you, you really need to lean on systems. You don't need to be inventing new ones at that time. And then when you're trying to do the post-mortem after, you definitely don't want to be trying to figure out how you're going to answer that. So all the planning has to come into place, and all that muscle memory to do that should happen. Like I think, Allison, you had mentioned the conflict sometimes between uptime and security, IT operations versus security. And it's like, you know what? If you leverage BCP and DR, you can switch passengers on the bus and still provide both. There are ways that you can do mature IT management that also provides provides security. And security can help be an enabler of the business. But again, don't go create a new program. Don't create a new playbook. And so that's why as you can tell, I get a little passionate about, it's like, we've had the tools for 20, 30 years on what we need to be doing. It's just that we're not doing them, for various different reasons. I mean, I hear complaints about tech debt, politics. I mean, I hear it all. But the bottom line is we get everybody talking about the same stuff. What is it we're protecting? I mean, down to like assets, applications, file systems, data, where is it at? Then you can use a framework to determine how do you architect that data? How do you limit blast radius? How do you do segmentation? So that when these regulations come by, and again, we're only getting regulated because there's a problem that hadn't been fixed yet. to protect investors and protect consumers, then you can start really seeing the fruit of your labor once you can get those fundamental things out of the way. And you're right. Kudos to the folks that are willing to step up and jump into those roles. Go have that legal conversation to get your personal liability taken care of. But we need really good leaders that know how to navigate through things like this.
Well said, Tim. So it's that we have our playbooks and frameworks that we've had. We have to rely on them. We have to continue to use them. But because the stakes have gone up, use the word dysfunction, Tim. Do you see sometimes a lot of dysfunction? Like dysfunction now has massive consequences.
Yes.
It always had massive consequences, but now it's personal.
So in that dysfunction, gets equated to gross negligence. So now we're getting in all this malpractice area that security used to not have to be concerned about unless you were in specific industries. Well, now you got to be really concerned about it.
So, Tim, when we think about that challenge, how do we think about the tools and solutions that help us deliver better, deliver at an order of magnitude better? What needs to drive them? What should we be looking for? How do you think about that?
Well, when I go back as being a technologist, heart, an engineer, because I've been in like wealth banking, they give you a tool and say, hey, you need to deploy the solution. And we went through this phase for years of buying best of breed stuff and then trying to figure out how to cook it all together and make it work. And then we end up with these little mini fiefdoms or feudal kingdoms of people managing their own little special tool and nobody overwatching the big picture, what's going on. So what we've seen, I think even Gartner pointed this out maybe 18 months ago, that now the move is to go to platform based where we do have everyone working together, trying to get to the same information so that we know what it is we're protecting. And maybe your area doesn't protect, but 60 to 70% of the environment. You need to know what the other 30, 40% is so you can say, hey, don't they, use the excuse, I don't know what I don't know. I always ask my team, raise your hand if you're not here. And that wasn't a philosophical question. It was like, what we were protecting yesterday. And now we come in today, what are we protecting? Why do these new servers show up? Why did these desktops fall off? Why do these not have the security stack on them or the systems management stack? We need to be in a maturity level where all that stuff is almost automated. And we are getting there with some of the helps of, some of the more if this then that type of AI and expert system. We're getting to a point where that. So what I'm seeing is the focus is moving toward platforms, try to get out of these multitude of systems. We got dozens of cloud systems, 20 some agents on an endpoint, and then not to mention all the different processes that we have to go through to get the right data to the right person. Sadly, a lot of that data they get, and I've been through these discussions many times when I was in the seat, is like it's 7-day-old data or 2-week-old data. And I also joke that, well, you wouldn't, determine what to wear today based upon last month's weather. You can't manage your environment if you don't know what it is that you're supposed to be managing and what you're supposed to be securing. So when I see it as like, we've got to simplify. We've got to simplify our processes. We've got to simplify what it is we're doing and get back to the base roots of, hey, here's what I know about. What I don't know about, I can categorize and measure that risk a little differently. Here's how I'm going to manage it, and here's how I'm going to secure it. And I think that's where we need to move. We've just got to get back to the basics.
Shira, how do you think about this? How do you think about how to approach tools and solutions that can help you navigate through the heightened challenge of this moment?
So I have to say, Tim said it eloquently, and I'll highlight the point of know what you don't know. A lot of organizations would focus very heavily on the data they know, about the intel they know, and kind of put their heads in the sand like a pigeon, kind of ignoring kind of what they don't know because they don't have enough intel on it. So let's just highlight what we do know because it's something we can act on, and everything else we'll deal with it later. The deal with it later doesn't exist anymore. And obviously, as the cyber attacks and everything has escalated over the years, it's becoming even more prominent and everybody realizes it. But when it hits the bottom line, SEC puts something in there like this, people are going to be held liable. There's going to be fines. There's going to be real problems for people. Organizations now have to take it that much more seriously. So Tim, as you said, know what you don't know is exactly it, and make sure you get there.
Yeah, you can't, what's the old saying? You can't delegate. You can delegate responsibility or authority, but you can't delegate responsibility. I mean, in my Southern vernacular, those chickens do come home to roost. You will know exactly um, how expensive that's going to be. And I mean, Tanian is very proud to sponsor this. I will say, when I look at tools, and I've managed many, many tools in my career, over 30 some years in IT, it's that value of real-time data in crisis management. When you have systems that are just working like clockwork, and what could have been an issue, say 7, 8 days from now, you knew at 6 o'clock this morning that, hey, 900 servers showed up on the network that don't have all the protection tools. And my boss used to say, or we would have something go down. I'm like, that's not a big deal. We got another one, we'll be fine. He goes, would a fire department say just because we have one fire truck working, it's still good when we're supposed to have 3 working? It's like, no, we always have to be ready for prevention, for proactive behavior. And that's the one thing I saw that I'm very optimistic about the SEC rules is when we've talked about programs, is that they want to see a proactive program. They want to see how is it you're measuring. Any kind of compliance audit, regulatory audit I've ever done, it's like, yeah, I can give them an answer. And then we might prepare 60, 90 days to give them that answer because they gave us that, leeway. But that's not what they want. What they want is, if it's a metric, you better have the formula, how often you're calculating it, what you're doing when it goes in and out of a certain band of thresholds. And what I'm seeing from the SEC is that other folks will kind of catch that fire, that it's not important enough just to say, this is our percent patch efficacy. It's important to say, hey, we can tell you beyond a shadow of a doubt that we're patching 99.9% of our critical assets within 3 days, or 98% of our desktops within 30 days for these, and showing something that is sustainable, evidence that you can show that this is happening. When we get there, that's when you'll see a turn, for how security looks. We used to, what's the saying? You don't have to be faster than the bear, just faster than the person next to you. I like to put it like this: attackers are always looking for low-hanging fruit. Don't be an orchard of opportunity. Lean into those programs, get those things down, have your hip pocket numbers like your MTTRs, which is mean time to resolve, or MTTD, mean time to detect. Know those, measure those, know what they're doing. Then you can confidently sit in a CISO seat and go, I know what I know. I know kind of what I don't know about, but you know what? These are the programs in place that are going to keep us faster than the bear, or our peer that the attackers are also after.
Now, Tim, I think I've heard you use the term continuous compliance. Is that right? Like, what you're describing sounds to me like more of an ethos of continuous compliance. Is how do you think about it? Is that right, or is there more to that concept?
Yeah, when I was manufacturing way back, and I remember we had our first audit. It was like a health audit. It wasn't FDA. It was like GMP, good manufacturing practices. We were supplying the healthcare industry. And I remember the boss coming in, and he got mad because we all wore suit and ties. And these regulators don't wear suit and ties. And he made us wear our uniform because we were manufacturing. And he told us, you never, you pass an audit. You don't score an A. So C is good enough. And I didn't understand that when he said it. And I'm not saying that because it is. Now that I've been years in the different industries, pass and fail doesn't matter. But I would always see audits, and I have gone toe to toe with some auditors, internal ones as well as external ones, that what they're asking for is just basically ridiculous. We don't have the resources to do what you're doing, that nobody's doing that. You're just making this up, that kind of stuff. But I've also taken the opportunity to realize, when I self-disclose what I know could be better, then guess what? I can get monies approved, resources approved to do that. We are in an appetite right now, or in an atmosphere or environment now, where there is no more plausible deniability. It's kind of a side tangent, but if you're a CISO or a leader and they're telling you no, then just make sure it's documented that somebody else is responsible. There is no plausible deniability of what the problems are. So when I talk about continuous compliance, is if I see an audit that is asking for something reasonable, that, you know what, we should be doing this anyway, then again, it's not a snapshot. I don't just do it and give it to them Tuesday afternoon at the meeting and say, here, we're good. No, I figure out a way that I can provide that, whatever that evidence is. It's typically a metric of some type. And I can have that metric so it's continually generated. And I can put the right eyes on it when that metric goes out of bounds. Some of you'll have like minimum thresholds, maximum thresholds. And when you do that, you can do continuous compliance. Now, granted, For small enterprises where you got one person, it used to be like me that fixed the phone system and the printer and took out the trash sometimes. I mean, it's hard. But for what we're getting to, we're talking about publicly traded companies that need to put the resources so you can get to the maturity level where continuous compliance is not a buzzword. It's just the way you do work. Again, leaning on frameworks and programs and having playbooks that are there for you to, just exercise.
Shira, how are you seeing organizations put this into action, this concept? Like, how are they actually getting to that point?
No, good question. And, I'll talk a little bit about in the past. In the past, companies would be very reactive. They would be, okay, this happened. Now, what do we do should this happen? And they'd focus on what is our messaging out to everybody? How do we get back up to business? And the world has shifted. The cybersecurity world has shifted even before all this, where they were becoming heavily proactive and understand to be proactive as well as reactive. It has to go hand in hand. And exactly as Tim said and described it through the ongoing compliance and continuous compliance, that's a big part of it. Being proactive in your cybersecurity approach. What is your playbook? How is it being handled? Who is your cybersecurity incident commander? What is the hierarchy down? What happens should an incident occur? And who reports to who? Because you can imagine when an incident happens, total chaos. You got to shut down things quickly because you have to really understand where the attack is, what it's getting to, and you don't want it to spread within the organization. So there has to be able to have movement in a proper and appropriate way. So your proactive approach is not just, okay, what are we going to do when it happens? But we need to understand how to get ahead of it in a way that's going to be not just good for the company, but also good for the employees within the company, that they can act in a way that's appropriate for internal and external facings of the organization. So companies are really understanding that and have started implementing it. And now I think it's more of with an urgency. Certainly with this SEC filing, the urgency is that much greater. They're understanding that, now there's personal liability, there's fines, there's all sorts of things that happen, but it's also bringing it to the forefront of organizations' minds, of the C-suite's minds, that they really need to understand how to do it and do it right.
So Tim, I was hoping to get a temperature check from you. Since you're talking to organizations every day, you're out, doing quite a few speaking events, customers. How are you seeing customers react to this? How prepared are they, or seeing organizations react to this? How prepared are they, and where are they in the journey of where they are now and where they need to go?
Right.
Help us understand,
how's the landscape? It runs the gamut. I have some that think, I wouldn't say arrogantly, but they're very confident that, okay, they almost seemed annoyed that, okay, it's just another disclosure rule. And I always tell them that just make sure, I look at that as an opportunity to show your board what you're doing well and what you need to improve. And then the other part are the ones that are just flat out scared. It's just like, I've had some conversation like, I've been trying for 4 years to get rid of Windows 7 machines or these old Windows servers that I got to get rid of, and I can't. They won't give me the money to do it. So that they're just scared. It's like, matter of fact, one said, I'm debating, do I just leave the company because they are not listening to me, and I don't want to be caught handing the bag. I had the whole plausible deniability talk. I say, yeah, you really want to make sure that they understand what it is. So yeah, I see the gamut, from the completely scared to, I don't want to say arrogant, but almost overly confident, on what it is they're doing. Now, those are very, very few and in between. When I start digging in, the joke is that you get the people that are confident, they are 100% sure of the 80% they know about. And as Shira had talked about, they know exactly, like, I know I'm good here. I did want to tack on to what Shira said, as far as the planning, be sure to test that planning. Shira, you mentioned a couple times, you've got your cyber insurers, they'll have their own border team, whether that's an incident responder, the negotiator, those kind of things. You need legal counsel, as I mentioned earlier, internal and external. You got the team that's going to make a decision. Make a decision in your playbook, whether you're going to pay the ransomware or the extortion or not. And when you do these exercises, we did many of them, but usually you have to do at least 4 a year. We would do 2 tabletop virtual and 2 kind of on site. Some people might be virtual, and get those done, because you will discover then, sure, you just so rightly pointed out, somebody you might have is a very technical top shelf talent, and you put them in as the incident handler or the chief incident responder. They don't have the personality for it. They don't have the temperament for it. And you will only learn that when you actually go through a test. You don't want to be doing that when everything is hitting the fan. Heaven forbid you actually have, reporters already after you trying to figure out what's going on. So in your testing your plans, again, you'll find out where you need this. If I can do like a management plug, this is when you realize how diverse a team it takes to do this. Who is going to handle PR for you? That's something people never really figure out, is that we got this plan, but oh no, now somebody's got to do it. We have seen tons of examples in the last 2 years where some companies disclose breaches very, very nicely and eloquently. Some do not. Typically, they don't. And then 8 months later, you hear about it. Again, hence the SEC rule changes. They're not going to get away with that in the future. So anyway, I just want to add on to that gamut of responses is take the opportunity to prepare. Not only make sure your plans are intact, but test your plans. That will help you feel much more confident and less scared, if you will, in what it's going to take to move forward.
So Shira, I'm curious about a temperature check from you too. You are obviously talking to so many different organizations as well. And so what are you seeing about where they are in the journey? And I'm also curious too, Tim mentioned budgets to be able to support the CISO in this as well. And I'm curious how this can affect the relationship between CISOs and other C-suite executives when we're talking about budgets. What are you seeing in the journey and in that dynamic between other C-suite executives?
Certainly. And Tim, of course, I'm not speaking for you. I'm speaking for CISOs I spoke to and I've been speaking to. I speak to them regularly. And one of their biggest frustrations are lack of budget. Mm-hmm. They're, from what I understand, and again, I haven't been a CISO, and Tim is the expert here as a CISO, but working with them and speaking to them for 20 years myself, it's more of so much pressure, so many things to do, so much security out there, so many problems to fix, so much security needed, but the budgets are so slim and they're being cut left and right. Companies are now holding on to money more and they want to be careful with their budgets, so they slash them. And sadly, they have to be slashed from every department, including security. So I will see there's two of them, as Tim mentioned also. There's the overlap of nothing's going to happen to us, the overconfidence. And then there's the other pieces, we're not prepared because we don't have budgets, and how am I supposed to do everything when I'm not being supported by the organization itself, because they would say that's not something we have to look at right now. It might be something down the road. Yet the CISO is the one who's sitting there with the most intel and understanding of the whole scope of the security environment of the organization, that they need to be looked at and heard in a different vacuum than specifically others in the organization, because the intel is that much greater. So if the budgets aren't given to them in a way, or even as a group, to sit and hear what the CISOs have to say and hear why they need the budgets and actually give them what they need to do their job well, it's not only frustrating for the CISOs, it's not helping the organization. It's hurting the organization. Mm-hmm. So there's massive frustration across there. And on the flip side, as Tim did mention, is the overconfidence. It's not really going to happen to us now. We'll deal with it when we get to it. So it's really a hierarchy of the two.
So Shira, how can CISOs be more effective at getting the budget they need to be able to support the organization in this context?
So good question. So again, Tim, I'll call in some good things you said. When you're having these incident response testing, so you're doing the tabletops, and simply the CISO speaks up and can really highlight the terrible things that can happen should something go wrong, and what it could cost the organization, reputation, monetarily, across the board. Then on the flip side, if we have a budget for XYZ, look, we will save the money, we will save the reputation, we will continue as is. And it's really understanding the bottom line. At the end of the day, organizations are all about the bottom line. We either need to make money, we need to save money, we need to do well. So, I look at technology in a threefold: a nice to have, a good to have, a need to have. Similarly to this, the need to have is either I can make money or I'm going to lose money. If the CISO is not given what they need right now, that is the highest point of a need to have, because either the organization is going to lose money, lose reputation, Or they could continue business as usual, curtail what's going to happen, curtail the incident, get through it smoothly, and they'll continue operating and continue making the company money. So they have to talk in order to be heard. They have to talk to the ears in a way that need to be heard, in the way they want to be told something.
So Tim, from your perspective, what should be guiding the CISO in terms of where the investments should be made that are going to make the most impact? What should they be focusing on where to make those, or how to think about making those investments?
Well, first, generally, you have to prepare your budget requests with data. I mean, you just can't, come in and request. It's got to be real data. Like, we're going to shorten, our patch times from here to here, or we're going to reduce maintenance costs on this end of systems. And also, this means work with your peers. I mean, I was in an organization once where cyber was getting tons of money. Matter of fact, we had to tell them stop. But our problems were over in IT, who wasn't getting any money, and their tech debt was mounting. And so we had to go and negotiate and actually, help the person out and go say, hey, this money you want to give us, while we would love to use it, we need to go fix this other problem over here because it's causing problems. We can't be secure. Then there's the adage. I mean, sure, you put a 3, you can always boil it down to what is important and what is urgent and say, do that. And then there's the practical stuff of, look at where you're already spending money. A lot of the money we're spending is on sometimes not wasted, but archaic processes. The way we've done, say, software deployment or patching for the last 15 years can be done much more efficiently now. And we've got some, sacred cows, if you will, on how processes are done in politics because they don't want change, but do that. So go through practical exercises like tool consolidation. Where am I spending money on all these things that, I can get back? And there are some tools out there that will get you an ROI. Security is almost always looked at as never. It's the department to know. There's never an ROI. You're just putting more locks on the doors and trying to figure out better ways to hand out keys to those locks. And that kind of thinking doesn't work. But get very pragmatic, very practical. What is urgent? What is important? Look at where you're spending your money, doing some exercise on what tool consolidation will do. And there are some things that you could be doing better that will give you an ROI. It just will. I've experienced that. So that's where I would start. That's not the end all. But again, arm yourself with the data. If you present a board with data and they say no, guess what? That liability is on the board. It's on them. As long as you document it, I go back to plausible deniability and say, hey, I've armed you with the data, but don't just go in with some cushy request and a Santa Claus list. That never works. Make sure you have data to back up what it is you want to spend money on and where you need it to help protect the organization and either decrease cost for the organization or increase revenue for whatever company you're working with.
So I wish we could keep talking there's so many different areas I want to dive into more, but we're just about out of time. So I have to ask my last question as a speed round. So I'm hoping to get one last piece of advice for the CISO in this moment based off of this. And so just a quick thought, Shira, could you give one last piece of advice for our audience?
Certainly. So maybe a CISO should separate what happened from what the organization is going to do about it. And sometimes those get melded together and it sounds very simplified, but at the end of the day, not getting caught up in it, but understanding on how to move forward and just keep moving that ball forward.
Beautifully said. Tim, last piece of advice, speed round?
I would say use this as an opportunity. Go read the rule changes. It's not just bedtime fodder. Go read the case against SolarWinds. That's all public knowledge. Go read that. And then sit back, know, manage, secure. Know what it is you're going to manage and then secure what it is you're managing. Once you do that, and I always love to say, truth is not an average. Go back to the basics. What it is you're supposed to be managing, securing. Don't quit trying to average a bunch of things together and think we're good enough.
Beautiful. Well, we're about to do the live drop, but before I do, I want to give a shout of thanks to Tanium for making today's conversation possible. And a really warm thank you to you, Shira, and to you, Tim, for sharing your perspective with all of us. And thank you, Tim. I so appreciate this. And thank you, everyone who listened in.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.